Chapter 1. The scent of kiln-fired clay mingled with the sweetness of lemon sponge and Earl Grey as the villagers gathered in the sunlit garden behind Hartington Kilns, St. Petronella's pride and joy. The studio, once a medieval pottery workshop, had been lovingly restored into a quaint artisan centre, where potters sold hand-painted wares and tourists snapped photographs beside cracked urns and ivy-strewn stoneware ovens. On this particular afternoon, a spring tea fete was in progress, the first in a series of community fundraisers chaired by Mrs. Constance Brentwood, the formidable patroness of the arts and self-appointed guardian of the village's historical soul. Dressed in a pale lilac shawl and speaking with deliberate grandeur, Mrs. Brentwood gestured from table to table with a polished ivory cane and an air of tragic benevolence, though no one quite remembered what tragedy she had endured. A scattering of villagers sipped tea or nibbled pastries at iron-wrought tables. Dr. Lionel Weeks, the local physician with restless fingers and an eye for the younger potters. Miss Gilda Crane, a gifted ceramicist in her 30s, with a nervous laugh and too much rouge on her cheeks. Reverend Simpkins, beaming with mild confusion. And, of course, Miss Marple, seated quietly in the shade, her attention fixed not on the croquet match beyond the hedgerow, but on the china teacups placed at each setting. "They've used the Marbury pattern," she said mildly to no one in particular. "A rare choice for a casual garden tea. A bit ostentatious for Mrs. Brentwood's usual taste." Only young Alice Brentwood, the patroness's great-niece, overheard. She glanced at Miss Marple with curiosity. "Do you think so? Aunt Constance insisted on it." Miss Marple smiled, her fingers toying with her teacup handle. Then perhaps she meant to impress someone. Inside the cool studio building, beside stacks of clay platters and hand-painted vases, the atmosphere was less harmonious. Raised voices trickled from the far corridor. Gilda Crane's unmistakable tones brittled with tension. "No, I won't be pushed out again. You can't do that. Not now. Not after everything." A man's voice responded, lower, clipped. "Don't be melodramatic, Gilda. You've already caused quite enough of a scene." Moments later, the door creaked open, and Mr. Bertram Bertie Holroyd, the studio's business manager, emerged looking flushed and pale. He greeted a few guests stiffly and vanished into the orchard. Gilda followed after a pause, adjusting her scarf with trembling hands. Miss Marple watched the exchange over the rim of her teacup. By 4 o'clock, the fete wound down. The tables were being cleared, the last of the sponge cake wrapped in greaseproof paper. Reverend Simpkins gave a jovial farewell and clapped Dr. Weeks on the back, while Mrs. Brentwood cornered a trembling potter to inquire why the slipware owl sculpture had been removed from its usual shelf. Just as Miss Marple rose to return to her lodgings, Alice Brentwood came rushing across the garden. Her expression was oddly blank. "I think someone's collapsed," she whispered. "In the kiln room. It's Mr. Holroyd." Within moments, a small crowd had gathered inside the studio's rear chamber. The main kiln, once used for mass firings, now held display pieces behind a roped barrier. Mr. Holroyd lay just beyond it, sprawled on the slate floor. His head was tilted at an unnatural angle, and a faint trickle of blood ran from his nose. Dr. Weeks knelt beside him, and after a tense pause, looked up and shook his head. "Gone. Possibly an aneurysm, or a fall. We'll know more when the police arrive." "An accident," someone whispered. Miss Marple stepped forward slowly, eyes sweeping the room. No broken pottery, no signs of a struggle, just the subtle smell of something faintly metallic, not blood and not clay. She knelt delicately beside the rope barrier, her eyes drifting to the side shelf. A single teacup rested there, different from the Marbury-patterned cups used outside. Its rim had a thin crack and a pale ring at the bottom. Miss Marple didn't touch it. Instead, she turned toward Alice Brentwood, whose face was pale and unreadable. "Did Mr. Holroyd join us for tea?" Miss Marple asked softly. "No," Alice murmured. "He refused. Said he wasn't in the mood. I think he poured himself a cup inside. He always did hate these fundraisers." "Curious," Miss Marple said gently, "especially since that cup doesn't match the set." As the first sirens neared from the main road, Mrs. Brentwood swayed against the kiln wall. "Not here," she whispered. "Not at my studio." But the quiet dread spreading through the room said otherwise. Chapter 2. The police arrived with the dusk, their black Morris Minor rolling up the narrow lane between hedgerows in near silence. The lead was Inspector Crail, a tall, angular man with a severe parting and a pencil-thin moustache, whose expression suggested that every domestic incident bored him until proven otherwise. "Sudden death," he muttered, squinting at his notebook as the constable logged the scene. "No visible injuries save minor cranial bleeding, possible stroke, or, at his age, perhaps his heart simply gave up." He said it loudly enough for the surrounding villagers to hear, as if to guide the hero narrative early. Miss Marple stood near the kiln room's entrance, a soft shawl folded across her arms. She neither interrupted nor corrected, but her gaze flicked once, briefly, to the teacup that still sat untouched on the shelf. No one had bagged it yet. Inside the room, Dr. Weeks was quietly questioned by Crail. "Time of death?" the inspector asked. "Hard to be precise," Weeks replied. "He wasn't cold when I found him. Could be within the hour. Possibly during the tea, though he wasn't outside with us. And as you can see, no sign of trauma. He may have fallen. He had dizzy spells, I know that much." "You were his physician?" "Not formally. He preferred to keep things quiet. Private man, Bertie." Private man, Bertie." "Private, indeed," muttered Crail. "And well liked." There was a silence. Miss Marple noted how no one answered that immediately. By the time the body was removed, twilight had settled. The villagers trickled out with a strange combination of hushed concern and latent curiosity. People stood in knots on the gravel path, muttering. A few glanced back toward the kilns with wary eyes, as if the historic studio itself had betrayed them. Gilda Crane stood alone near the hydrangeas, her scarf crooked and her knuckles pale as she gripped a cigarette she hadn't lit. Miss Marple approached gently. "You argued with Mr. Holroyd today," she said, not unkindly. Gilda flinched. "You heard that, did you? Hard not to. The acoustics of old stone buildings carry rather far." Gilda exhaled slowly, eyes clouded. "He threatened to revoke my lease. Said my stall would be given to someone from Bristol. An outsider, can you imagine? Over a business dispute. There's always something more with Bertie. Always some history he holds over you. He knew things, used them." Miss Marple tilted her head. "Used them how?" Gilda shook her head. "Doesn't matter now, does it? He's gone." Miss Marple didn't press. Instead, she touched Gilda's arm lightly. "Did he often drink tea in the kiln room?" "He had his own stash. Cheap leaves. Hated the garden fetes. Said they were distractions. But he'd always watch from the side. Said it let him see people's real faces when they didn't know he was looking." "Curious habit," Miss Marple murmured. Later that evening, The vicarage drawing-room was still warm from the embers in the hearth. Miss Marple sat with Reverend Simpkins and his wife, Mrs. Lydia Simpkins, sipping a mild chamomile. "Constance Brentwood is already speaking as though it were a tragic accident," Lydia said with a slight edge. "Poor thing, so terribly shaken, though one wonders if that's just embarrassment. She hated scandal." Miss Marple said nothing for a moment, then looked thoughtfully at the vicar. "Did you know Mr. Holroyd well?" Reverend Simpkins folded his hands. "We spoke from time to time, but he was not a religious man. Practical, bitter even. Gather he'd made some poor investments years ago and held it against nearly everyone. He was unkind." Lydia nodded. "He knew too many secrets. Pride. Watched. The kind of man who asks questions in order to remember the answers later. People avoided him. Yet no one seemed terribly surprised to see him working at the studio." Miss Marple mused. "He owned a portion of it, I believe," said the vicar. "A legacy. Though how he obtained it, well, that's one of those village stories no one really tells in full. Then perhaps it's time someone did." The following morning, Inspector Crail returned to the studio to conduct formal interviews. The village buzzed. Word had spread. Mr. Holroyd's death might not have been natural. The whisper started with Edna, the young assistant who'd helped serve tea. She'd mentioned it innocently to the postmistress. He looked strange. His lips were almost blue, not right for a faint. By midday, the idea of poison had found purchase in half a dozen households, each adding its own twist. Rat poison, bitter almonds. A drop slipped into milk. Miss Marple, however, was far more interested in the teacup. She visited Sergeant Reed, the constable assisting Crail. "I understand there was a teacup found near the body," she said with her usual mildness. Reed blinked. "Yes. Odd one, that. Not from the same set as the garden cups. Could you describe it?" "Brown glazed, chipped at the base. Bit old-fashioned. Looked handmade, actually. Could have come from the studio's older stock." "Curious," Miss Marple murmured. "You've had it sent for testing, I assume." "Inspector's orders. Though between us, I don't think they'll find anything. There wasn't enough left in it to sample much." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Then perhaps the real clue lies not in what was in the cup, but in who placed it there." She left Reed scratching his head. That afternoon the studio reopened to staff and select artists, though the public was kept away. Miss Marple walked the grounds with quiet purpose. She paused near the south shelf, where the cracked teacup had rested, now removed. She eyed the labels beneath each piece. Tiny handwritten slips: Raku glazed sugar bowl, G. Crane, lidded spice jar, A. Brentwood. But the spot where the teacup had sat bore no label at all. No one had claimed it. And yet someone had made it. Miss Marple glanced out the open window, where the village cat stalked across the herb garden. She whispered, almost to herself, "Every piece has a maker, and every hand leaves something behind." Chapter 3. The sky over St. Petronella shifted with unsettled clouds, casting flickering shadows over Hartington Kilns. Inside the Pottery studio, the air carried a faint scent of burnt earth and damp wool, as staff returned to their work under the watchful, unspoken tension that now accompanied every movement. Miss Marple entered quietly that morning, ostensibly to browse a replacement for a chipped sugar bowl. At least, that was what she told the young potter at the entrance. But her eyes weren't drawn to merchandise. They lingered instead on the back wall shelves, particularly the spaces missing labels, and on the behavior of the staff who now moved about like dancers, unsure of their choreography. One in particular, Alice Brentwood, seemed changed. Gone was the bright, curious energy. She worked in silence, arranging ceramic glazes with excessive precision, her eyes avoiding the kiln room completely. Miss Marple stepped nearer. "A busy morning, my dear." Alice gave a small start. "Yes, just reorganizing the oxides. We're still open, technically, and Aunt Constance insists we maintain appearances." Miss Marple nodded. "A wise instinct, but also exhausting, I imagine, maintaining appearances while everyone speculates behind your back." Alice glanced around, then whispered, "They think I know something." "Do you?" There was a long pause. Then, very softly, Alice said, "I saw him drink from the brown teacup." Miss Marple waited. "I didn't mean to spy, but I come in to grab more napkins." He poured from the kettle, stirred something in, then just sat down, staring at the wall. Her voice faltered. He looked pleased with himself. Pleased? As if something had gone according to plan. And then, Alice hesitated. "I left before he noticed me. By the time I returned, well, you know the rest." Miss Marple touched her arm gently. "It's very helpful that you told me." But as she turned away, her brow furrowed. Something about Alice's voice had been too level, too well rehearsed. Meanwhile, Inspector Crail was circling his own trail of inquiry. He had returned from the regional pathologist with vague confirmation of suspected poisoning, though the exact compound remained uncertain. Something subtle, possibly herbal, possibly rare. "I'd wager it was in the tea," he muttered, pacing the vicarage lawn beside Sergeant Reed. "The cup itself's being examined, but I'll be damned if that Pottery place doesn't have a dozen glazes containing arsenicals and God knows what. Could have been contamination." Reed frowned. "Then again, sir, could have been deliberate." Crail paused. "You believe someone meant to kill Holroyd?" "I think someone certainly didn't mind that he's dead." That afternoon, Crail summoned Gilda Crane for formal questioning at the station. "You argued with Mr. Holroyd?" he said bluntly. "Yes, so did half the village. You had motive." "I had reason," she corrected, eyes sharp. "But not motive for murder. I've put everything into that studio. You think I'd kill the one man with power over my lease?" Crail folded his arms. "Maybe you knew he was going to push you out. Maybe this was preemptive." Gilda laughed, dry and brittle. "Where were you between 3 and 4 on the day of the fete?" "I was tending to Mrs. Withers's twisted ankle. She tripped over a parasol." "Anyone confirm that?" Weeks nodded. "Reverend Simpkins saw me leave her cottage. I believe he remarked on my lateness to the tea." Crail scribbled, non-committal. "One last thing, Doctor. Have you ever handled the studio's pottery glazes?" "I dabble," he said, tone light. "Strictly amateur. Though some of the older compounds contain fascinating things. Arsenic, lead, antimony. History is full of poison, Inspector." He left with a faint smile. At twilight, Miss Marple visited Alice Brentwood again. This time she brought no pleasantries. "You lied to me, Alice." Alice looked stricken. You said you saw Mr. Holroyd pour the tea himself, but the fingerprints on the cup, only one clear set, and they weren't his." Alice's hands trembled. I didn't want her to be dragged into it. "Your aunt?" Alice nodded. Miss Marple stepped closer. "Did she place the cup there?" "No." A whisper. "I did, but not to poison him. I thought he would see it, recognize the design. It was from the first set she and Mr. Croxley ever made together. I thought it would remind him." "Of what?" Alice swallowed hard. "That he didn't build this place. He stole it." Miss Marple paused. "And the tea?" "I brought it from the garden tray. Same as everyone else had. Nothing was added." Miss Marple looked closely. Alice's tears were not guilt. They were frustration, regret. "You were trying to provoke shame, not death." Alice nodded. "But instead, he died." Miss Marple walked home slowly under a rising moon. She now knew Constance had motive and knowledge of blackmail. Dr. Weeks had opportunity and knowledge of poison. Alice had guilt, but not murder in her heart. Yet one question lingered still. Who would know the precise glaze, the subtle compound, the tea's exact bitterness, and use it not to threaten but to silence? The answer would not be found in the studio's ledgers or the village's gossip. It would be found in behavior. And Miss Marple had already seen the one gesture that didn't fit. Chapter 5. By midweek the rain had passed, but an invisible fog lingered over St. Petronella, thick with questions no one dared ask aloud. At Hartington Kilns the daily rhythm had resumed, soft hammerings whirring potters' wheels, the faint hiss of steam rising from cups of tea. But tension clung to the corners like damp clay. Miss Marple arrived just after 11, carrying an unassuming parcel wrapped in brown paper. She handed it to Lydia Simpkins, the vicar's wife, who had volunteered to help reorganize the kiln room displays. "Just a small commission I'd like flyered," Miss Marple said mildly. "A jam jar with a honeysuckle pattern. I thought the studio might like the work." "Oh, I'm sure they would," Lydia replied, taking it carefully. "You know, Gilda's been refusing custom orders all week. She says the kiln still smells of death." Miss Marple's eyes wandered to the back display shelf. Poor Gilda, and yet she was always so meticulous. Every piece with its mark, her little wave etched under the glaze. "That's right," Lydia nodded. "Each artist signs their work." "Yes, and yet," Miss Marple said softly, "the brown teacup bore no mark at all." At that same hour, Inspector Crail interviewed Mrs. Brentwood at the parish hall, away from the studio's distraction. "You claim Mr. Holroyd was blackmailing you," Crail began. "He was." "And yet you never brought it to the police." "There's no dignity in public scandal, Inspector, especially when it drags the dead through the mud." "Would you say you had reason to want him silenced?" Her eyes held his. "Yes, but I did not poison him. I do not kill men, Inspector. I survive them." Crail considered this. "Did you notice anything unusual the day of the fete? Any behavior?" Constance paused. "Yes, the young assistant Edna. She was nervous, avoided the kiln room entirely after tea was served." "Did she know Holroyd?" "Barely, but she served the tea." Crail found Edna at her aunt's cottage by the cricket ground, plucking mint leaves. "I didn't kill anyone," she blurted before he'd even asked. "I didn't say you did," he replied. She looked down. "But I did take a second tray to the kiln room. I wasn't supposed to." "Why?" "I found a cup on the counter. Not one from the Marbury set. A plain brown one. It didn't look washed. I thought someone might want it refilled." "You touched it?" "Just the handle. Then I poured the tea. Didn't stir it, I swear. And did you leave it for Mr. Holroyd?" "I don't know," Edna said. "I left it on the corner shelf. I didn't even see him." Crail jotted a note, frowning. "Who else knew you brought it?" "No one. I didn't even tell Gilda." Crail didn't believe her, but the fear in her voice wasn't criminal. It was anxious. the fear of a girl who suspected more than she understood. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple visited Gilda Crane in her side studio. Gilda sat hunched at her wheel, hands dusted in dry porcelain, her expression carved with exhaustion. "I thought you weren't accepting commissions," Miss Marple said, her tone light. Gilda didn't look up. "Not for strangers. Just the locals I trust." "You were close to Nathaniel Croxley, weren't you?" Gilda's hands froze. "That was years ago. But you remember him." "Of course I do. He taught me everything. I was barely 20. Miss Marple sat on a stool. "Was Mr. Holroyd part of the studio then?" "Number. He showed up when Croxley died. Took over everything. Bribed the solicitor, if you ask me. Found the will no one could prove was real. He pushed out everyone who mattered." "Even you?" Gilda's eyes burned. "Especially me. Said I was too attached. Called it a conflict of interest. But I never left. I took my corner and stayed. That's what I do." "And yet," Miss Martle said gently, "you didn't sign the brown teacup." Gilda froze. "I never made that cup." "Are you certain?" She met Miss Marple's eyes. "I'd know my own glaze, and I'd never leave a piece unsigned. Even my worst ones have my mark." Miss Marple stood, smoothing her gloves. "That's what I thought, dear. Thank you." Just before sunset, Miss Marple visited Inspector Crale at the station. "I believe you should look into the studio's firing logs," she said quietly. "Why?" "Because someone fired that cup recently, within the last week. And if we know who signed off on the kiln schedule, we'll know who made it." Crale leaned back, intrigued. "You think the cup was made specifically for the murder?" "No," Miss Marple replied. "I think it was made to look ordinary, to blend in. But its silence, its lack of signature, is the signature." Crale considered this. "Someone made it, delivered the poison, and then stepped away." "Exactly," said Miss Marple. "And now they're hoping the clay will conceal the motive." Crale rose. "I'll have Reed pull the logs tonight." Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the window, where the last light flickered across the thatched rooftops. She said quietly, "There's one more thing. The way Mr. Holroyd drank that tea, alone, content. Someone made sure he didn't suspect a thing." Crale frowned. "So, someone he trusted?" "Perhaps," Miss Marple said. "Or someone who gave him what he wanted. Control, even in his final sip." Chapter 6. Inspector Crale was not a sentimental man, nor particularly fond of pottery. But as he leafed through the Hartington Kiln's firing ledger that evening, he felt a distinct thrill at the neatness of the deception. The log was precise, each entry listing the potter's name, the clay type, glaze code, and kiln duration. It read like a ship's manifest, and most entries were initialed. Except one. A firing entry dated 3 days before the fate, signed with a looping flourish. N.C. Crale tapped the initials. "Nathaniel Croxley's been dead for years." Sergeant Reed, peering over his shoulder, muttered, "Someone signed in his name." Crale closed the book, or wanted us to think so. They retrieved the corresponding kiln drawer. From the ash-cooled shelf, 4 small items had been recorded. Only 3 remained. One was missing. The following morning, Miss Marple sat with Reverend Simpkins under the linden tree in the churchyard, listening to the bells being rehung. "You knew Mr. Croxley, didn't you?" she asked, her voice light as thistledown. "Oh, yes," said the vicar. "Troubled man, passionate about art, less so about order. I think he loved too much, especially things that didn't love him back." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Did he leave anyone behind?" "No family. but there were rumors. A few thought he had a child, illegitimate. There was talk, someone he taught at the studio. And you never followed up. Reverend Simpkins sighed. This is a village, Miss Marple. Sometimes we let silence do the heavy lifting. Back at the kilns, Constance Brentwood arrived unannounced, trailing the scent of bergamot and disapproval. She strode past the salesroom and into Gilda's corner studio, where Miss Marple stood admiring a newly fired vase. "You've stirred quite the hornet's nest," Constance said without preamble. Miss Marple turned. "Have I?" "I've just come from Inspector Crail. He believes someone used Nathaniel's name in the kiln log. He asked if I'd seen anyone signing in late at night." "And had you?" Constance paused. "No." Miss Marple tilted her head. "But you had a key." "I keep a spare. Everyone knows that. Even Mr. Holroyd." Constance's eyes narrowed. Bertie wasn't clever enough for subtle work. His crimes were always crude. "Then whose work was this?" Miss Marple asked softly. "Someone who remembered Croxley, who knew his glazed style, someone who could mimic him, or who shared something of his blood." Constance stiffened. "You're suggesting what? That Nathaniel had a child in the village, that one of our potters is—" Miss Marple said nothing. She didn't have to. Meanwhile, Alice Brentwood stood alone in the storeroom, staring at a chipped shard of pottery she'd tucked behind the tins of red clay. It was the lip of a cup, brown glazed, faintly bubbled, with a peculiar spiral beneath the surface. She hadn't meant to keep it. But when she found it in the waste pile, broken, discarded, after the police had combed the shelves, she couldn't throw it back. It looked so familiar, and yet she could swear she'd never seen that glaze pattern before. Not in any of the studio's public work. A hand landed softly on her shoulder. She turned to find Doctor Weeks behind her, his expression unreadable. "Are you all right?" he asked. She nodded, though her fingers tightened around the shard. "Grief comes strangely, doesn't it?" he continued, "especially when the person we've lost wasn't someone we entirely liked." "I didn't lose him," Alice whispered. I thought I understood him." Weeks looked at the pottery fragment. "That's not one of yours." "No," Alice murmured, "but I think I've seen the technique in one of the old portfolios." He frowned. "Old work?" "Yes, from years ago. Pieces Gilda keeps in the flat files. I used to study them." Weeks's voice changed slightly. "Show me." Down in the archive room, the two leafed through thick portfolios of sketched forms, glaze recipes, and photographic samples of early kiln collections. Most were signed in broad, uneven cursive, Croxley, Crane, and a few by Brentwood herself. And then a page tucked near the back. 4 small thumbnails, each depicting a brown teacup, each showing the same spiral glaze design as the broken cup in Alice's hand. But the signature was unusual. Not a name, just an initial. L. Alice blinked. "I never noticed that one before." Dr. Weeks stood very still. "It's not one I recognize." But Miss Marple, standing quietly in the doorway, had already guessed. "You do recognize it?" she said gently. "You just didn't expect anyone else to." They turned. Miss Marple moved into the room, her hands clasped. "L for Lionel. Isn't that right, Doctor?" Weeks smiled slowly. "That's quite a leap." "But not a difficult one," she replied. "You studied under Croxley before pursuing medicine. The records show it. You were an apprentice here once, briefly. A teenage hobby. A hobby skilled enough to produce that teacup. One glaze recipe, buried deep in studio history. You used it because no one else remembered it. but someone did. She looked at Alice. You. Alice looked from Miss Marple to the shard in her hand, her mouth parting in sudden understanding. You made the cup, Miss Marple said to Wicks, and planted it, knowing Edna would innocently deliver it. You counted on chaos, on the village's suspicion falling on Gilda, or Constance, or Alice, but you underestimated the signature, or rather, the lack of one. You always signed your pieces as L, quiet, obscure, but distinctive. And then you forgot that no crime stays buried when a potter's hands remember texture. Weeks's jaw clenched. You had a motive, Miss Marple went on softly, but he threatened to expose your past addiction. That was reason enough. But more than that, you resented him for taking Croxley's place, for destroying what might have been yours. A pause. Did he know who you were? Weeks didn't answer, but he didn't deny it. Chapter 7. The following morning, Dr. Lionel Weeks was nowhere to be found. His surgery remained shuttered. No patients admitted. The curtains drawn, the brass plaque gleamed in the morning sun with a politeness that felt somehow disingenuous. Inspector Crail, having received Miss Marple's statement regarding the Pottery archives and the signature L, had promptly dispatched Sergeant Reed to locate the doctor. He returned within the hour, breathless and empty-handed. He's gone, sir. His housekeeper says he left last night. Took his medical bag and overcoat. Said he'd be back after making a call. Never returned. Crail pinched the bridge of his nose. We're not calling it flight yet. No, sir. But everyone knew it was. In the quiet calm of Miss Marple's parlour, the fire cracked gently. She sat opposite Alice Brentwood, who had arrived in the early afternoon, pale and burdened by something unsaid. I didn't want it to be him, Alice said quietly. He always seemed so composed, rational. I even thought he fancied Gilda once. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Rational minds can do irrational things when bruised, especially if one's legacy is threatened. Alice toyed with a teaspoon. Do you think he really was Croxley's son? I believe he believed it. That's the crucial thing. Whether or not it was true, Lionel's identity was built on something buried, something that felt stolen. Holroyd, brash, grasping, shameless, represented everything he couldn't forgive. But then, why not confront him? Because people rarely confront what shames them. They wait, and then sometimes they break. At Hartington Kilns, the atmosphere had curdled. Fewer customers wandered the showroom. The studio's artists worked in silence, glancing up whenever a shadow passed the window. Miss Marple returned that afternoon, not to ask questions but to observe. It was then that she noticed a new piece on Gilda's bench. A vase, unfinished, yet unmistakably familiar. The glaze, a gentle spiral, the base, unsigned. Gilda, she said softly, that pattern, it's similar. Gilda looked up, and for the first time in days, her eyes weren't angry. I found an old slip book Lionel must have hidden. Techniques, sketches, tests. He left it behind when he left the studio the first time. I suppose I never knew how much of him remained in the clay. You admired him. I admired his restraint, his understanding of line, but I never trusted his silences. Miss Marple nodded. Nor should you have. Silence is where some people sharpen their intentions. By evening, a letter arrived at Inspector Crail's desk, penned in dark green ink and hand-delivered by a local boy. The envelope bore no return address, but inside lay a folded page. Dr. Weeks's confession, written in sparse, clinical prose. To whom it may concern, Bertram Holroyd threatened to destroy what little dignity remained in my name. He held knowledge of my past addiction, and hinted often at my supposed connection to Nathaniel Croxley, whose work I revered and whose trust I once enjoyed. He dangled ruin over my head for years, smirking, careless, immune. I poisoned his tea, carefully, sparingly, an infusion of monkshood, aconitum steeped with precision, a dosage that would delay symptoms, mask itself as a fainting fit. I made the cup. I signed it without signing. I left no mark but my hand in the glaze. You will not find me. I am already gone. There is no justice for men like me, only silence. L.W. Crail folded the letter slowly. He means to vanish, he muttered, but he'll have to surface. They always do. Miss Marple, seated nearby, said nothing. She traced the brim of her own teacup thoughtfully. The following day, a discovery was made near the marsh at Dunley Hollow. A bicycle, half submerged, its tires caked in reeds. In the reeds beside it, a medical bag. Empty, but no body, no coat, no Dr. Weeks. Back in the village, the talk was split between two theories. Gone abroad, said the butcher, like a coward. No, replied Mrs. Weatherby from the post office. He's drowned himself. That letter was goodbye. Miss Marple neither confirmed nor denied either version. She returned to her garden, snipped dead blossoms from her rose canes, and quietly reflected on the notion of justice, the visible kind, and the kind that remained in shadow. It wasn't over, not yet. There was still one unanswered thread. The letter had been composed with meticulous precision, scientific terminology, calculated pacing, but not a word of remorse. And that, Miss Marple thought, was telling, for the guilty seldom weep, but those who act to protect do. She looked once more at the pottery. She looked once more at the pottery shard Alice had kept. The spiral design, subtly off-centre, not quite perfect. No, Lionel hadn't made it for his victim. He'd made it for someone else to find. Chapter 8. By the time Dr. Lionel Weeks's confession circulated through St. Petronella, it had already lost its sting. The shock had worn off, replaced by something more corrosive. Uncertainty. He was gone, but not confirmed dead. He had confessed, but not in person. And though the letter admitted guilt, something still felt unfinished. Miss Marple, for her part, spent the following morning in quiet study. At the back of the parish archives, she retrieved Croxley's kiln notebooks, preserved in worn leather covers, pages of notes on glaze temperatures, firing techniques, and the personal touches Croxley insisted made every piece speak. Miss Marple ran her gloved fingers over a particular line, nearly illegible with smudged ink. Glaze spiral equals not signature. Voice. To the trained eye, no two spirals are ever the same. Mine descends clockwise. Lionel's counter. She folded the book closed. The cup had spiraled clockwise. At Hartington Kilns, Gilda Crane was methodically packing a row of her pieces, preparing them for an upcoming exhibition in Devon. She looked up when Miss Marple arrived, unannounced, but not unwelcome. "I thought you might come," Gilda said, voice neutral. Miss Marple smiled softly. "I was hoping to ask you about the firing logs again." Gilda reached for a box of straw and gently placed a vase inside. "Inspector Crail already asked." "Yes, but Crail isn't asking about spirals." That made Gilda pause. "I'm sorry." "The brown cup," Miss Marple said. "It spiraled clockwise. Croxley's design, not Lionel's. According to Croxley's own notes, Lionel glazed in the opposite direction." Gilda said nothing. Miss Marple continued, her voice gentle but firm. "That cup wasn't made by Lionel. He signed a confession, yes, but not a full one. He took credit for something he didn't finish. Gilda's hands tightened around the vase. Why would he do that? To protect someone? Gilda stared at her, the silence building like pressure inside a kiln. Then, almost inaudibly, he knew. Knew what? Gilda placed the vase aside and sat. Her shoulders, always squared, slumped. That I was Croxley's daughter. Miss Marple said nothing, just waited. Gilda stared at the stone floor, eyes distant. He never claimed me, not publicly, but he taught me. Gave me my first bench, my first tool set. When he died and Holroyd seized control, I thought, well, that it was over. But Lionel, he figured it out. The old glazes, my handwriting, even the way I arranged my tiles. He saw it, and he said nothing. Miss Marple moved closer. He knew Holroyd was blackmailing your mother, knew he was a thief, and knew you'd never be allowed to inherit Croxley's legacy openly. Gilda nodded. So he protected me. For years. Then, last week, I told him about the exhibition, how Holroyd planned to cut me out. Again. And Lionel just looked at me and said, I'll make sure he's quiet. I didn't think he meant. She trailed off. But he didn't poison him, Miss Marple said softly. No. Gilda's voice was thin now. I did. The studio felt smaller with the truth spoken aloud. I didn't mean to, Gilda continued, her voice steadier now. But when I saw the cup Lionel had made, I swapped it, reglazed it with Croxley's formula. Holroyd always favoured Croxley's work, he wouldn't have noticed, and I infused it. Aconitum, like Lionel described. He kept a dose locked in his satchel for experiments. It only took a drop. Miss Marple studied her. You intended to frame Lionel? No. Gilda met her eyes. He knew. He let me. Silence settled. He said, I'll leave something behind, enough to draw them to me. Let them think it was me. No one will question it if I disappear. And we both, thought that would be the end. But it wasn't, Miss Marple murmured. Number because you always notice spiral directions, Miss Marple. That evening, Miss Marple met with Inspector Crail under the portico of the vicarage. Rain had begun to fall, soft and rhythmic. She handed him a folded note, brief and neat. What's this? He asked. The second half of the truth. Crail read in silence. When he looked up, his face was unreadable. You're certain? She swapped the cup. He supplied the poison. It was collusion, but not in equal measure. His disappearance was meant to protect her, but the spiral betrayed her hand. Crail nodded slowly. I should arrest her. You should speak to her, Miss Marple replied. Then decide if prison is the only justice available. The next morning, the village awoke to another ripple of news. Gilda Crane had turned herself in. No dramatic confession, no denial, just a quiet statement submitted through Reverend Simpkins and a pottery bench left meticulously clean. The brown spiral cup, now preserved in an evidence case, bore no signature, but it spoke volumes, and Miss Marple, as she trimmed the edges of her rose bushes, allowed herself a rare moment of melancholy. For some murders were not born from cruelty, but from the exhaustion of being silenced too long. Chapter 9. The next days passed not in drama, but in quiet shift, a rearrangement of roles, as if the entire village had to adjust to a kiln's new firing temperature. Gilda Crane, once the studio's fixed presence, was gone from her workbench. She had been taken quietly, without handcuffs, into county custody, where a formal inquiry would follow. Inspector Crail himself had filed the report with dry efficiency, premeditated tampering with food or drink resulting in fatality. And yet, around St. Petronella, the tone was not of scandal. It was softer, understanding even, as if the village had accepted something unspoken, that Bertram Holroyd's death was not wholly a crime, but a long overdue correction. Only Miss Marple remained uneasy. She took tea that morning in the vicarage garden with Reverend Simpkins, the spring wind tugging lightly at the tablecloth. "She'll be sent to trial," the vicar said, not meeting her eyes. "But there's talk it may not proceed harshly. The coroner's report notes shared culpability, and Lionel's disappearance, well, convenient," Miss Marple said mildly. The vicar sighed. "You think he's alive? I think he wanted us to think otherwise." There was a long pause. "Would it matter," he asked at last, "if he were alive and far away? The one who poured the poison confessed. Wouldn't chasing the accomplice only deepen the wound?" Miss Marple stirred her tea. "Justice is not about wounds, dear Reverend. It's about balance, and the scale is still tipped." That afternoon, Miss Marple visited the Pottery Studio's archive room again. Though Gilda was gone, her workspace had remained untouched. Someone, perhaps Alice, had laid a cloth across her wheel. The glazed jars were sealed, the shelves orderly, but the flat files were not. Miss Marple opened the central drawer and sorted through the portfolio where she'd found Croxley's sketches. Tucked behind a weathered sheet of glaze patterns, she discovered a second envelope. Small, unlabeled. Inside were 4 photos, all black and white, all featuring pieces clearly from Croxley's early days. And in each photo, the same figure appeared in the background, a boy, perhaps 17, with a slim build and sharp features. Hands dusted with clay, smiling faintly. She recognized him now. Dr. Lionel Wicks. A handwritten caption on the back of one photo read, "L, too reserved for a signature, but he makes the most delicate base handles I've seen." A student with silence in his hands. Miss Marple closed the folder. He had loved Croxley. And he had worshipped Gilda. Perhaps that was the motive all along, not ambition, but protection. Later, at Brentwood House, Miss Marple was admitted to the parlour by subdued Alice. "My aunt's resting," Alice said. "She hasn't spoken much since Gilda turned herself in. I imagine this has stirred up quite a lot." Alice nodded. She's always cared deeply for appearances. Losing control of the studio, the village gossip, she sees it as a collapse, as if all the history she preserved was wasted. "Perhaps it wasn't wasted," Miss Marple said gently. "But perhaps it's time that history was shared." Alice hesitated. "There's something you should see." She led Miss Marple to a study just off the parlour. The room was narrow, lined with books and filing boxes. From a bottom drawer, Alice produced a worn folio titled Kiln Trust Records, Private. She opened it. Inside were original deed papers from the studio's founding. One signed by Nathaniel Croxley, one initialed by Constance Brentwood's late husband, and a third, unsigned, but clearly marked with the watermark of the local solicitor's firm. "It's a will," Alice said, "unfiled, Croxley's, leaving his stake to my daughter, should she claim it." Miss Marple read the line carefully. "So it was true," she murmured. "Gilda had a legal right. Holroyd must have suppressed this." "Or Constance," Alice said, almost reluctantly. "She found this file years ago, hid it again, said it would only make things messier." Miss Marple nodded slowly. She was right. Truth often does. That evening, Miss Marple returned home and did something she rarely did. She wrote a letter. To the Chief Constable, though the case of Bertram Holroyd's death appears closed by confession, I must bring to your attention the likely survival of a co-conspirator. Dr. Lionel Weeks. His confession, while factual in its own admission, contained inconsistencies that suggest the true criminal act, preparing the fatal cup, was not his. And more curiously, he confessed in order to disappear, not as an escape from justice, but as a shield for someone he cherished. He may be hiding under the name of Lionel Croxley. Please alert ports, clinics, and any known art communities where such a name may appear. Respectfully, Miss Jane Marple. She sealed it neatly and placed it by the door. Tomorrow she would post it, and the mystery would truly begin to close. In the shadows of the coastal pottery town of Lyme Regis, a man rented a small cottage on the edge of the cliffs. He gave his name as L. Croxley, said little, sired delicate pieces of earthenware with spiral motifs, signed nothing. But when the village children visited his studio, he told them stories of a woman who made glazes sing, and a man who silenced them, and he never served tea. Chapter 10. A week had passed since Gilda Crane's quiet confession, and still the village of St. Petronella had not returned to its normal rhythm. The spring fades continued, shortbread was baked, lilacs trimmed, but a subtle silence lingered, especially around Hartington Kilns, now operating under limited hours. Miss Marple, though never one to meddle without cause, had found herself walking past the studio more often than usual. She noted every closed shutter, every flickering lantern behind a frosted glass, every trace of former routine that now seemed frozen. On this particular morning, Alice Brentwood approached her on the lane, cheeks flushed with unspent emotion. I don't know what to do," Alice said breathlessly. "The trustees are meeting. Aunt Constance refuses to attend. They want someone to step in to manage the kilns temporarily, and they've asked me." Miss Marple gave her a thoughtful smile. "And are you tempted?" "I'm terrified," Alice admitted, "but I've also seen what happens when strong women stay silent." Miss Marple's gaze warmed. Then perhaps it's time one of them finally spoke. Inside Brentwood House, Constance remained withdrawn. She received no visitors save the vicar, and had taken to wearing darker colours than her usual lavender and pearl. Alice found her that afternoon in the library, leafing through old donation ledgers. "They're asking me to take over," Alice said. Constance didn't look up. "Then say no." "I can't. You'll disgrace us both." Alice's voice grew firmer. "I'm not the one who buried a will." That struck home. Constance closed the ledger. That will would have started a war. Number it would have started a truth. There was a long pause. Then quietly, "She was Nathaniel's daughter." "Yes," Alice said, "and she deserved more than a corner table and decades of whispers." Constance didn't reply. Her hand hovered over the closed book. And then, in a rare moment of candour, "Perhaps I did want to preserve the name more than the truth. But at my age, one starts to wonder what preservation is worth." At the post office, Inspector Crail received a telegram from Dorset Constabulary. Subject: L. Croxley sighting confirmed. No arrest made. Not pursued. Local officer judged no threat. Man appears solitary. Keeps no social contact. Refuses interviews. Loves modestly. Exhibits no intention of further flight. Crail tapped the paper with the end of his pencil. "Could have been worse," he muttered. Sergeant Reed, folding postal slips beside him, asked, "Will we go after him?" Crail glanced toward the window. No one wants a doctor's name in the paper, especially not one who cured more than he harmed. Reed hesitated. "Miss Marple won't like that." Crail smirked. Miss Marple already knows, and she's done. She was, in fact, not quite done. That evening, Miss Marple took a final walk through the village and paused at the edge of the churchyard, where a few clay wind chimes had been hung near the gardener's gate. Their soft, hollow clinking in the breeze reminded her of teacups tapping saucers. There was something circular about it all, as if the spiral from the teacup had wound its way through every corner of the village and left behind tiny cracks no one could quite mend. She found herself joined by Alice, who held a letter in her hand. "I received this today," Alice said, "postmarked from Lyme Regis." Miss Marple read the handwriting without needing to open the envelope. "He thanked me," Alice murmured, "said he hoped I'd make something beautiful from all of this, that Gilda's name should live in the Glaze records officially now. He asked for nothing, not even forgiveness." Miss Marple nodded slowly. He already received what mattered. She trusted him to carry her silence. Alice blinked. He did more than that. He became her silence. Later, back at home, Miss Marple opened her sewing box and drew out a single slip of paper. Her own letter to the chief constable, stamped but never posted. She had intended to send it, but she hadn't. She folded it slowly, deliberately, and placed it at the bottom of the box. "Some truths," she whispered, "belong to those who already paid their price." The mystery had been solved, and yet the wound would never quite close the way porcelain could. Some pieces, even when mended, kept their hairline cracks, invisible, but there just the same. Chapter 11. 3 weeks after the fate and the quiet death in the kiln room, Hartington Kilns reopened under new signage. The Croxley Brentwood Studio, Community Trust Restoration, in progress. The name stirred murmurs through the village, a fusion of legacy and honesty. And it was Alice Brentwood who stood quietly behind that decision. It had been a difficult naming. There were meetings, calls, a tense conversation with her aunt, and a final signature, Constance's, made without ceremony but with unmistakable resignation. Now standing by the counter with a clipboard and a pencil behind her ear, Alice looked the part of someone who'd chosen purpose over fear. Miss Marple entered the showroom just as the last of the morning's rain slid down the front windows. "I see the shelves have been restocked," she remarked. Alice smiled. "We've decided to rotate everyone's work more fairly. No more back corners for certain artists. A good change. The quality often begins in how we arrange shelves." Alice chuckled lightly, then grew serious. "I've made arrangements with Gilda's solicitor. Once the trust is formalized, her name will be listed on every historical plaque. She'll be remembered properly." Miss Marple nodded. "And what of the exhibition in Devon?" "I'm attending," Alice said, "as her proxy." There was a long, calm silence. "You've come a long way, Alice," Miss Marple said softly. Alice looked down. "Because of everything that happened?" "No," Miss Marple replied, "because of how you chose to respond." That afternoon, a small crowd gathered for the studio's first public demonstration since the incident. A children's clay workshop, overseen by a new volunteer from the nearby college, was met with enthusiasm. Though whispers still passed between parents. Was it safe? Wasn't this the place where... Miss Marple sat beside the Reverend and Lydia Simpkins, sipping lemon water and watching the small hands shape bowls and pinch pots with giddy lack of precision. "Funny, isn't it?" Lydia said. "The world continues, even when we're not sure it should." Miss Marple nodded. "Because it must." You never said what convinced you Gilda, not Lionel, made the final switch." Miss Marple smiled faintly. Croxley's glaze spiraled clockwise. It was instinct, not imitation, and only one person in that studio had hands that moved in the same rhythm. His daughter. Lydia was quiet for a long moment. "Do you think she'll be convicted?" "No," Miss Marple replied. "I think the trial may never come. Not out of injustice, but discretion. The letter, Lionel's vanishing, the murky property papers, none of it makes for a simple prosecution. And even the Crown sometimes recognizes when punishment would only reopen wounds." "And Weeks?" Lydia asked quietly. Miss Marple looked toward the horizon. "Gone, but not lost." The same day, at the edge of a cliffside town, a small parcel was received by post at the Lyme Regis Artists Cooperative. No sender. Inside, a thumb-sized ceramic seal, etched with a double spiral. One clockwise, one counter, no signature, no note. But for those who knew how to look, it said everything. Back in St. Petronella, Constance Brentwood emerged from her seclusion at last. She returned unannounced to the studio late one afternoon, and moved from shelf to shelf like a ghost, taking inventory of a life once owned. At last, she reached the display table near the front window, where Alice was arranging a new bowl. Gilda's last. Without speaking, Constance took the bowl gently in her hands and turned it over. Etched at the base, GC, followed by a thin trailing line that looped once clockwise, once counterclockwise, just like the seal that had arrived at Lyme Regis. Constance said, "She signed it after all?" Alice nodded. "Only once. She said she wanted her name to appear just once, when the truth could finally hold it." Constance placed the bowl back down, scented it with care, and walked to the door. Then, just before leaving, she said, "It's beautiful work." And for the first time in years, she meant it. That evening, Miss Marple sat by her lace-curtained window, watching the lamplighter make his rounds. Another story had ended. Quietly, precisely, without fanfare. Yet some part of her still lingered in the kiln room, by that shelf, beside the cup no longer there. Not because she feared what had happened, but because she respected it. Because some tragedies were not crimes, but choices wrapped in desperation, grief, and loyalty, too long ignored. She poured herself a cup of tea, breathing in the steam, and thought of the glaze that had held the poison, how it had also once held art, and memory, and legacy. Clay was fragile, so were people, and yet under the right fire, both could be made to last. Chapter 12. The following Saturday dawned bright and unseasonably warm, the kind of morning that made even the village's darkest corners seem briefly forgiving. At Hartington Kilns the mood was quieter than festive. Alice Brentwood had posted a sign near the studio gates. Open Day, in honor of Gilda Crane. Free demonstrations, public glazing, and a small dedication ceremony at noon. It wasn't advertised beyond St. Petronella, nor meant to draw outsiders. This was for the village, for the potters who stayed, for those who chose to remain and rebuild, kiln by kiln, shelf by shelf. Miss Marple arrived just before 10. She moved slowly through the crowd forming near the herb garden, where tables had been laid with bowls of slip and pigment. Children hunched eagerly over damp clay discs, their tongues tucked in concentration. Teenagers, awkward but earnest, asked Alice questions about raku glazing and firing curves. A display table near the front entrance had been prepared by Lydia Simpkins, a modest tribute of Gilda's work, curated without sentimentality, just balance. Near the base of each piece, a small card now read, "Gilda Crane, studio founder, unofficial but no longer unrecognized." It was Lydia who approached Miss Marple, dabbing her brow with a folded handkerchief. "She would have hated this sort of attention," Lydia said quietly, "but I think she would have liked the truth being out." "Some legacies are made louder by silence," Miss Marple replied. "Others need names." At noon, Alice stood beside the newly mounted brass plaque near the main kiln room. Her voice carried clear across the gravel. "This building was once named after 3 donors, all male. Only one of them actually shaped clay, and none of them are here any more. But we are, and we remember." A pause. "We remember the ones who weren't given the credit. We remember the ones who worked in corners, behind locked glazed cabinets, signing only with spiral marks or not signing at all. Today we name them, not because we must, but because we can." She stepped aside. The plaque gleamed in the midday light. The Gilda Crane kiln room, in recognition of the hand that shaped without acclaim. For several seconds no one clapped. The stillness was heavier than silence. It was reverent. Then someone, not Miss Marple, nor Lydia, nor the vicar, but young Edna, the assistant who'd once feared she'd poisoned a man by mistake, clapped first. The sound spread. Then laughter. Then the kiln was lit for the ceremonial demonstration. Later, after most of the guests had trickled away, and the studio had been swept clean of biscuit crumbs and damp glaze brushes, Alice found Miss Marple sitting alone on the low stone wall behind the herb beds. "The firing went well," Alice said. "We're already getting commission offers." Miss Marple gave a small, warm nod. "You've earned them." There was a pause. Then Alice asked very softly, "Do you ever wonder if we told the wrong story?" Miss Marple raised an eyebrow. "Wrong?" "I mean Lionel's confession. It was half true, and Gilda's was only whispered. There's no trial now, no headline, just a missing doctor and a dead man with too many enemies. What if people misremember this one day?" Miss Marple studied her for a moment. "Then you must write the right story down. In glaze, in studio records, in a whisper over tea. History isn't what gets published, it's what gets preserved." Alice smiled faintly, almost in relief. "I'll see to it." Miss Marple reached into her handbag and handed Alice a folded envelope. Alice opened it slowly. Inside was a single photograph, the same one from Croxley's archive. Young Lionel Weeks, hands dusted in clay, eyes alight with something neither pride nor hunger, but belonging. "He may never return," Miss Marple said, "but he left more than enough behind." Alice held the photo for a long time before tucking it carefully into her apron pocket. That evening, the church bells tolled for evensong. Miss Marple walked alone along the path between the linden trees and paused briefly beside a small private memorial, recently added beneath the rose trellis near the kiln wall. In quiet memory of Bertram Holroyd, troubled, misguided, human. It was a compromise, crafted by Alice, agreed to by Constance. Not a celebration, not a condemnation, just a sentence that finally told the truth. Miss Marple adjusted the small flower pot beside it. A sprig of thyme had been planted there, its green just starting to lift through the soil. She whispered almost absently, "Time is for courage and for memory." Then she stood and walked home, knowing there was nothing more to say. Far to the south, in a weather-worn cottage above a bay of pale pebbles, a man turned a freshly fired pot in his hands. The glaze was irregular, cool ash blue, speckled with smoke trails. He examined the base, then set it aside without marking it. But on the shelf behind him, among dozens of unsigned vessels, one stood apart, etched beneath its base, barely visible without turning it to the light. GC/LW. Fired once, remembered twice. Chapter 13. It was late spring in St. Petronella, and the village had begun to exhale again. The climbing roses along the churchyard wall were in bloom, the air tinged with elderflower and the scent of warm brick. The Hartington kiln sign had been restored fully, its lettering cleaned and newly gilded, and beneath it a second panel now read, "A Trust for Quiet Makers." At the centre, it bore no initials, only a symbol, carved so lightly beneath the base that it could only be seen when held to the light. A double spiral, entwined but never tangled. Meanwhile, across the village green, Miss Marple sat by her window, knitting needles resting idle on her lap, tea cooling gently beside her. The mystery had ended without drama. No newspaper had printed the full truth. No trial had marched through court. No name had been publicly disgraced. But justice, in its quiet form, had been served, not for punishment, but for peace. As the first stars emerged over the hills, she allowed herself a brief thought, not of guilt or deduction, but of legacy. Not the kind etched in marble, the kind built slowly, piece by piece, fired, cooled, signed only when the clay had set completely. And in that there was peace,